Hi library friends, it's Miss Abby. Welcome back for another episode of Read Aloud Roundup. Now remember, this is kind of like a book club where we read a little bit from a lot of books by the same author, and it gives you kind of a flavor or a taste of what their writing is like. If you like what you hear, then you can go to the library and read the rest of the book that I started reading to you, and let me know. Is this the kind of book you like? Let's read more. This month we're focusing on Neil Gaiman. Now, last week we read a little bit of Fortunately the Milk. Did you like that story? Me too. It's pretty funny. And the more you read on in it, the funnier and the more absurd it gets. So, what are we going to read this week? This week we're reading Odd and the Frost Giants. Let's get started. Today's book is called Odd and the Frost Giants. Now this is written again by Neil Gaiman, but this one has illustrations by Brett Helkvist. He does the illustrations in the Lemony Snicket series, a series of unfortunate events. So if you like those illustrations, then maybe you'll see something unique that you like in this book as well. You ready? Let's get started. Odd and the Frost Giants, Chapter 1, Odd. There was a boy called Odd, and there was nothing strange or unusual about that. Not in that time or place. Odd meant the tip of a blade, and it was a lucky name. That sounds pretty cool. He was odd, though. At least the other villagers thought so. But if there was one thing that he wasn't, it was lucky. Whew. If you had to choose odd or lucky, which one would you choose? Something to think about. Oh boy, this part gets a little sad. His father had been killed during a sea raid 2 years before, when Odd was 10. It was not unknown for people to get killed in sea raids, but his father wasn't killed by a Scotsman, dying in glory in the heat of battle as a Viking should. So they're Vikings. That's an interesting thing to know. He had jumped overboard to rescue one of the stocky little ponies that they took with them on their raids as pack animals. They would load the ponies up with all the gold and valuables and food and weapons that they could find, and the ponies would trudge back to the longship. The ponies were the most valuable and hard-working things on the ship. After Olaf the Tall was killed by a Scotsman, Odd's father had to look after the ponies. Odd's father wasn't very experienced with ponies, being a woodcutter and woodcarver by trade, but he did his best. On the return journey, one of the ponies got loose during a squall off Orkney and fell overboard. Do you know what a squall is? A squall is like a really, really big wave kind of storm that's out at sea. Odd's father jumped into the gray sea with a rope, pulled the pony back to the ship, and with the other Vikings, hauled it back up on deck. He died before the next morning of the cold and the wet and the water in his lungs. Oh man. When they returned to Norway, they told Odd's mother, and Odd's mother told Odd. Odd just shrugged. He didn't cry. He didn't say anything. That's a little unusual. Nobody knew what Odd was feeling on the inside. Nobody knew what he thought. And in a village on the banks of a fjord where everybody knew everybody's business, that was infuriating. Ooh, people are angry that they don't know what he's thinking, huh? There were no full-time Vikings back then. Everybody had another job. Are there full-time Vikings now? Football players, right? Sea raiding was something the men did for fun or to get things they couldn't find in their village. They even got their wives that way. Ooh. Odd's mother, who was as dark as Odd's father had been fair, had been brought to the fjord on a long ship from Scotland. She would sing Odd the ballads that she had learned as a girl, back before Odd's father had taken her knife away and thrown her over his shoulder and carried her back to the longship. You should ask your grown-ups, is that how they met? No, that's pretty unusual now, huh? Odd wondered if she missed Scotland, but when he asked her, she said, no, not really. She just missed people who spoke her language. She could speak the language of the Norse now, but with an accent. Odd's father had been a master of the axe. He had a one-room cabin that he had built from logs deep in the little forest behind the fjord, and he would go out to the woods and return a week or so later with his handcart piled high with logs, all ready to weather and to split, for they made everything they could out of wood in those parts. Wooden nails joined wooden boards to build wooden dwellings or wooden boats. In the winter, when the snows were too deep for travel, Od's father would sit by the fire and carve, making wood into faces and toys and drinking cups and bowls, while Od's mother sewed and cooked and always sang. She had a beautiful voice. Od didn't understand the words of the songs she sang, but she would translate them after she had sung them, and his head would roil with fine lords riding out on their great horses, their noble falcons on their wrists, brave hounds always padding by their sides, off to get into all manner of trouble, fighting giants and rescuing maidens and freeing the oppressed from tyranny. Do you know what tyranny is? Tyranny is like when the government makes you do too much stuff. Kind of. Google it. After Od's father died, his mother sang less and less. Od kept smiling, though, and it drove the villagers mad. He even smiled after the accident that crippled his right leg. Oh, so his right leg got hurt really bad. He couldn't walk the same. It was 3 weeks after the longship had come back without his father's body. Od had taken his father's tree-cutting axe, so huge he could hardly lift it, and had hauled it out into the woods. Certain that he knew all there was to know about cutting trees and determined to put his knowledge into practice. He should possibly, he admitted to his mother later, have used the smaller axe and a smaller tree to practice on. Still, what he did was remarkable. After the tree had fallen on his foot, he had used the axe to dig away the earth beneath his leg, and he had pulled it out, and he had cut a branch to make himself a crutch to lean on, for the bones in his leg were shattered. Ouch. Look, there's a picture though of Od's father sitting by the fire carving. Somehow, he had got himself home, hauling his father's heavy axe with him, for metal was rare in those hills, and axes needed to be bartered or stolen, and he could not have left it to rust. So, 2 years passed, and Od's mother married Fat Alfred, who was amiable enough when he had not been drinking, but he already had 4 sons and 3 daughters from a previous marriage. His wife had been struck by lightning. Ooh, everyone has bad luck in this village. And he had no time for a crippled stepson, so Od spent more and more time out in the great woods. Od loved the spring, when the waterfalls began to course down the valleys and the woodland was covered with flowers. He liked summer, when the first berries began to ripen, and autumn, when there were nuts and small apples. Ooh, we're in autumn now. That's my favorite season. Od did not care for the winter, when the villagers spent as much time as they could in the village's great hall, eating root vegetables and salted meat. I don't know how I would like that. In winter, the men would fight and fart and sing and sleep and wake and fight again, and the women would shake their heads and sew and knit and mend. By March, the worst of the winter would be over. The snow would thaw, the rivers begin to run, and the world would wake itself again. Not that year. Winter hung in there like an invalid refusing to die. Day after gray day, the ice stayed hard. The world remained unfriendly and cold. In the village, people got on one another's nerves. They'd been staring at each other across the great hall for 4 months now. I know how that feels, right? It was time for the men to make the long ship seaworthy. Time for the women to start clearing the ground for planting. The games became nasty. The jokes became mean. Fights were to hurt. Ugh. Which is why, one morning at the end of March, some hours before the sun was up, when the frost was hard and the ground still like iron, while Fat Alfred and his children and Od's mother were still asleep, Od put on his thickest, warmest clothes, stole a side of smoke-blackened salmon from where it hung in the rafters of Fat Alfred's house, and a fire pot with a handful of glowing embers from the fire, and he took his father's second-best axe, which he tied by a leather thong to his belt, and limped out into the woods. Make a prediction. What do you think he's going out in the woods to do? Let's find out. The snow was deep and treacherous, with a thick, shiny crust of ice. It would have been hard walking for a man with 2 good legs, but for a boy with 1 good leg, 1 very bad leg, and a wooden crutch, every hill was a mountain. Odd crossed a frozen lake, which should have melted weeks before, and went deep into the woods. The days seemed almost as short as they had been in midwinter, and although it was only mid-afternoon, it was dark as night by the time he reached his father's old woodcutting hut. The door was blocked by snow, and Odd had to take a wooden spade and dig it out before he could enter. He's probably exhausted. He fed the fire pot with kindling and tended it until he felt safe, transferring the fire into the fireplace, where the old logs were dry. On the floor, he found a lump of wood, slightly bigger than his fist. He was going to throw it on the fire, but his fingers felt carving on the small wooden block, so he put it to one side to look at it when it was light. He gathered snow in a small pan and melted it over the fire, and he ate smoked fish and hot berry water. It was good. There were blankets in the corner still, and a straw-stuffed mattress, and he could imagine that the little room smelled of his father, and nobody hit him or called him a cripple or an idiot, and so, after building the fire high enough that it would still be burning in the morning, he went to sleep, quite happy. I wonder what's going to happen to him next. He's out in the woods by himself. He has an axe, and that's kind of it, right? Ooh, this is going to turn into a survival story, do you think? Those are fun to read. Let's keep going. Chapter 2, The Fox, the Eagle, and the Bear. I wonder what this will be about. Odd was woken by something scratching against the hut. Oh, is it going to be a scary story? He pulled himself up to his feet, thought briefly about tales of trolls and monsters, hoped that it wasn't a bear, then opened the door. It was daylight outside, which meant it was late in the morning, and a fox was staring up at him, insolently, from the snow. Its muzzle was narrow, its ears were pricked and sharp, and its expression was calculating and sly. When it saw that Odd was watching, it jumped into the air as if it were trying to show off and retreated a little way, and then stopped. It was red-orange, like flame, and it took a dancing step or two towards Odd, and turned away, then looked back at Odd as if it were inviting him to follow. Would you follow a potentially magic fox? It looks magic to me. What do you think? It was, Odd concluded, an animal with a plan. He had no plans other than a general determination never to return to the village, and it was not every day that you got to follow a fox. So he did. It moved like a flame, always ahead of him. If Odd slowed, if the terrain was too difficult, if the boy got tired, then the fox would simply wait patiently at the top of the nearest rise until Odd was ready, and then its tail would go up, and it would flicker forward into the snow. Odd pressed on. There was a bird circling high overhead. A hawk, Odd thought. And then it landed in a dead tree, and he realized how big it was, and knew it was an eagle. So we've got those 2 characters now. He followed the fox up a hill and down another. Down was harder than up for Odd in the snow with one bad foot and a crutch, and several times he fell. Oh, but he's got good stick-to-itiveness, right? And then halfway up another, to a place where a dead pine tree stuck out from the hill like a rotten tooth. Oh, that's a good image. A silver birch tree grew close beside the dead pine, and it was here that the fox stopped. A mournful bellow greeted them. Ooh, the dead tree had a hole in one side, the kind that bees sometimes inhabit and fill with honeycomb. The people in Odd's village would make the honey into the alcoholic mead they drank to celebrate the safe return of their Vikings, and the midwinter, and any other excuse they needed to celebrate. An enormous brown bear had its front paw caught in the hollow of the pine tree. Now we've got all 3 of the animals. Odd smiled grimly. It was obvious what had happened. In order to get at the pine tree hollow, the bear had leaned its weight against the birch tree, bending it down and moving it out of the way. But the moment the bear had pushed its paw into the hole, it had taken its weight off the birch, which had snapped back. And now the bear was profoundly trapped. Ooh, look at it. Do you see how trapped it is? It's trapped between those two. Uh-oh. The animal bellowed once more, a deeply grumpy bellow. It looked miserable, but not as if it were about to attack. Warily, Odd walks toward the tree. Above them, the eagle circled. Oh man, I'm getting nervous. Odd unhooked his axe from his belt and walked around the pine tree. He cut a piece of wood about 6 inches long and used it to prop the two trees apart. He did not want to crush the bear's paw. Then, with clean, economical blows, he swung the blade of his axe against the birch. The wood was hard, but he kept swinging, and he had soon come close to cutting it through. Odd looked at the bear. The bear looked at Odd with big brown eyes. Odd spoke aloud. "I can't run," he said to the bear, "so if you want to eat me, you'll find me easy prey. But I should have worried about that before, shouldn't I? Too late now." He took a deep breath and swung the axe one last time. The birch tree tipped and fell away from the bear, who blinked and pulled its paw from the hollow in the pine tree. The paw was dripping with honey. The bear licked its paw with a startlingly pink tongue. Odd, who was hungry, picked a lump of honeycomb from the edge of the hole and ate it, wax and all. The honey oozed down his throat and made him cough. The bear made a snuffling noise. It reached into the tree, pulled out a huge lump of comb, and finished it off in a couple bites. Then it stood up on its hind legs, and it roared. Odd wondered if he was going to die now, if the honey had just been an appetizer. But the bear got down on all fours once more and continued single-mindedly to empty the tree of honey. Whew, he's safe. It was getting dark. Odd knew it was time for him to head home. He started down the hill and was almost at the bottom when he realized he had absolutely no idea where his hut was. He had followed the fox to get here, but the fox was not going to lead him back. Oh boy. He tried to hurry and he stumbled on a patch of ice and his crutch went flying. He landed face first in the hard snow. He crawled towards his crutch, and as he did so, he felt hot breath on the back of his neck. "Hello, bear," said Odd cheerfully. "You had better eat me. I'll be more use as bear food than I'll be frozen to death on the ice." The bear did not seem to want to eat Odd. It sat down on the ice in front of him and gestured with its paw. "You mean it?" said Odd. "You aren't going to eat me?" The bear made a grumbling sort of noise in the back of its throat, but it was a gloomy noise, not a hungry noise, and Odd decided to chance his luck. The day could not get stranger after all. He clambered onto the bear's back, holding his crutch with his left hand and clutching the bear's fur with his right. The bear stood up slowly, making sure the boy was on, then set off at a fast lope through the twilight. As the bear sped up, the cold went through Odd's clothes and chilled him to the bone. The fox dashed ahead of them. The eagle flew above them, and Odd thought crazily, happily, "I'm just like one of the brave lords in my mother's ballads, only without the horse, the dog, and the falcon." And he thought, "I can never tell anyone about this because they won't believe me, because even I wouldn't believe it." Snow fell from branches as they brushed past and stung his face, but he laughed as they went. The moon rose, pale and huge and cold, cold, but Odd laughed some more because his hut was waiting for him, and he was an impossible lord riding a bear, and because he was Odd. The bear stopped in front of Odd's hut, and Odd half climbed, half fell from the beast's back. He pulled himself up with his crutch, and then he said, "Thank you." He thought the bear nodded its head in the moonlight, but perhaps he'd imagined it. There was a crash of wings, and the eagle landed on the snow a few feet from Odd. It tipped its head on one side to stare at Odd with an eye the color of honey. There was nothing but darkness where its other eye should have been. Ooh, it's missing an eye. That's cool. He walked up to his door. The fox was already waiting there, sitting like a dog. The bear padded up to the hut behind him. Odd looked from one animal to the other. "What?" he said testily, although it was obvious what they wanted. And then, "I suppose you'd better come in," he said. He opened the door, and they came in. Woo! That's where we're going to stop. What do you think is going to happen? There's these animals that are big, kind of scary predator animals, and Odd just had them come into his hut? Oh boy. Okay, that's where we're going to stop for today. But what I want to know is, are you interested in reading this book by yourself? If you are, run to your library. Maybe don't run. Casually stroll to your library with your grown-up and check it out. And then let me know. Make a prediction now about what you think is going to happen in the hut. And then let me know if your prediction was right. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I'll see you next time.